The first thing she recovered was her mother's handwriting. Not the words, just the shape of it, the way the letters leaned slightly left, as if pressing against a wind that wasn't there. She didn't know how long she'd been lying on the floor of the cell before that fragment surfaced. The cold had moved from her skin into her bones. The overhead light was the color of something dead, a flat, sourceless white that pressed on her eyes like a thumb. She blinked at it, and the handwriting dissolved. Her name was gone. She understood this the way you understand that a tooth has been pulled, not by remembering the tooth, but by running your tongue across the gap. Something had been there. Now it wasn't. She pressed both palms to the floor and pushed herself upright, and the room moved sideways. She caught herself against the wall. The wall was warm. Walls shouldn't be warm. She filed that away. There was a seam in the wall opposite her, a door-shaped interruption in the pale material, and beside it a panel with markings she did not recognize. The ceiling was high. The cell was shaped like nothing she'd seen in any room she could remember, and she could remember very little. Fragments, weights, the specific gravity of certain feelings, without their content. She remembered the feeling of watching someone else sleep. She remembered the texture of grief, the way it sat differently in the body than fear. She could not remember the face that belonged to either of those feelings. She touched the back of her skull. The implant was still there. She could feel its familiar disc shape through her hair, the slight raised edge of the interface port. They hadn't removed it. She didn't know if that was luck or strategy, and she filed that away too. When the door opened, 3 of them entered. She had no word for what they were, because she had no context for what she was seeing. They moved on 4 limbs, but held themselves upright in a way that suggested the forward 2 were optional, arms that became legs depending on the terrain and the decision. Their heads were wide and slightly flattened, with clusters of sensory organs arranged across the front that didn't map onto faces the way she understood faces. They wore something. Not clothing exactly. More like a system, layered functional material that moved with them and occasionally shifted color in ways she couldn't predict. They were approximately her height. They smelled like ozone and copper. The one in the front made a sound at her. She said nothing. It made the sound again, and this time she recognized the cadence. A question inflected at the end, the universal grammar of inquiry that apparently held across species. She still said nothing. She watched its sensory cluster orient toward her, and she understood that it was reading something about her, measuring, assessing. She kept her breathing controlled. She kept her face still. She gave it nothing. It produced a small object and held it toward her. The object emitted a thin beam of blue light that swept across her from head to foot, and then clicked off. Whatever it had measured, the 3 of them reacted to the result. A brief exchange of the clicks and tonal modulations they used between themselves. And then the one in front looked at her again. And this time she felt certain it was looking specifically at the back of her skull. At the implant. They knew about it then. The one in front reached out with one of its forward limbs and touched its own head, tapping twice at a spot that, on her, would be about where the interface port sat. Then it pointed at her. Then it made a gesture she understood without wanting to. An opening and closing of its appendage, fingers spread wide. A blooming, an opening up. She understood. They wanted to access the implant. They wanted what was inside it. And they had apparently decided, or discovered, that she couldn't stop them. She thought about that for a moment. Then she sat down on the floor, crossed her legs, and stared at the wall. The door-shaped seam opened and closed. She was alone. She had some time then to think. She used it. The implant was a Meridian Series 4 neural interface. She knew this the same way she knew her mother's handwriting, through the feel of it, rather than through explicit memory. It was standard issue for long-range reconnaissance and deep cover operations, and it held memory in a distributed array rather than a linear archive. This meant that even a thorough deletion pass, which was clearly what someone had attempted, would not be clean. It would leave gaps, yes. It would corrupt sequences. But it would also leave the distributed nodes intact in ways that a targeted deletion sweep would miss. Because the nodes weren't organized the way external tools expected. The Meridian didn't file memories by content. It filed them by emotional weight. A technical briefing in a child's birthday could be stored adjacently if they had the same felt intensity at the moment of encoding. Any deletion sweep looking for tactical data would skip the ones encoded under grief, under love, under the specific frequency of Ming's someone. They had swept her. She was almost certain of it now. Before she woke up here, or perhaps during the accident she couldn't remember, the event-shaped hole at the center of her timeline, Someone or something had run a deletion pass across her implant, looking for military architecture, tactical plans, command codes, the logistical structure of whatever unit she belonged to, and they had found some of it, certainly, enough to be satisfied, enough to think the job was done. What they had not swept, because they had not thought to look there, were the names. She closed her eyes. She reached inward. The interface was tactile, in the way of all Meridian units, not a visual display but a sensation of depth, of diving, of moving through something with density and temperature. She sank into it now, carefully, moving past the obvious corrupted sectors, the scorched voids where the deletion had hit cleanest. She felt them the way you feel missing stairs in the dark. Not the stairs themselves, but the lurch, the drop, the wrongness. There were many of them, more than she'd expected. Whoever had swept her had been thorough in the places they'd known to look. She moved past the voids. She moved into the warmth. The first thing she found was a meal. Someone had cooked something, and the memory was encoded in the smell of it. Something with herbs, something that had reduced on a stove for a long time. The kind of smell that means someone had been planning to feed people they loved for most of an afternoon. She didn't know whose kitchen it was. She didn't know if it was hers. But the feeling around the memory was specific. She had been very tired, and someone had handed her a bowl, and she had felt, for the duration of eating it, that the world was fundamentally survivable. She kept that one. She moved on. She found arguments. Training sequences that had been partially corrupted, but retained their emotional topology. The feeling of pushing past failure, the particular exhaustion of learning something that hurt to learn. She found a joke, just the punchline and the laughter around it. The full-body release of something genuinely funny. And she held onto the shape of that, because it felt like evidence of something she was. She found fear encoded in a very specific register. Not combat fear, but the sustained low-frequency fear of waiting, of not knowing, of caring about an outcome she couldn't control. She recognized that one. She'd lived in it, apparently. And then she found the names. They were everywhere, tucked into the corners of other memories, attached to feelings the deletion sweep had not identified as strategic. A name encoded in the weight of a hand on her shoulder. A name in the rhythm of a familiar walk heard from behind, identified before the face came into view. Names in the particular frequencies of different voices. This one laughed at a certain pitch. This one dropped volume when she was serious. This one had a habit of starting sentences mid-thought as if you had already been inside the conversation for a while. 7 names. She was almost certain there had been more. But she had 7, and she held them with the care of someone picking up broken glass, memorizing the weight and shape of each one, mapping them against the feelings they were indexed to. These were her crew. She didn't remember the missions. She didn't remember the ship or the theater of operations, or the nature of whatever conflict had brought her here. But she remembered the weight of these people in her life, the specific gravity of each of them, the way their presence had changed the air in a room. She remembered trusting them the way you trust the floor, not by thinking about it, but by walking on it. She opened her eyes. The cell was exactly as she'd left it. The sourceless white light, the warm walls. Somewhere beyond the door-shaped seam, the 3 of them were presumably waiting for her to become cooperative, or to become broken, or to become whatever they needed her to be, so they could extract the rest of what they wanted. She thought about what she knew. The implant's distributed architecture meant they couldn't access it externally without her cooperation, or without destroying the organic tissue around it, which would corrupt the data they were trying to read. The deletion sweep had already done significant damage. Any further incursion would likely destabilize the remaining intact nodes. She was, in this specific technical sense, safe from them, as long as she understood the architecture better than they did. This was not a guarantee, it was a window. She started mapping what was intact. The physical memory was largely undamaged. Procedural knowledge, the deep body kind that lives below the language layer. How to move, how to be quiet, how to read a room, how to take a fall and come back up. How to do the dozen small technical things her hands remembered without needing to ask her brain. The deletion sweep had targeted explicit memory, declarative knowledge, the kind you could write down and transmit. It had not touched the things that lived in muscle and instinct because it hadn't known to look for them there. She had her hands. She had her body. She had 7 names. She began methodically to assess the cell. The warm walls were not structural. They conducted something, possibly a part of a climate or environmental system. The seam was pressure fit, no mechanical locking mechanisms she could identify from this side. The panel beside the door had 6 markings. She studied them until she had them memorized. And then she let herself hypothesize about function based on placement and the contextual logic of door-adjacent controls. One of them almost certainly opened the door from inside. The question was whether it would open to a corridor she could survive or a corridor she couldn't. She thought about the 3 of them, the way they moved. The fact that they'd entered together. 3 was a strange number, a simple assessment visit. Odd enough that it suggested a protocol, a procedural requirement, which meant there were rules here, which meant there were people who wrote the rules and people who followed them, and probably some friction between those 2 populations, because that was, in her experience, how things worked when you had enough people in a room. She didn't remember the specifics of her experience, but its shape was intact. She thought like someone who had done this before, who had been in confined spaces with bad options before, who had run the math on worse odds and found ways through. She didn't know how she knew this. She knew it the way she knew her mother's handwriting, from the feel of it, from the lean of it into a wind that wasn't there. The light cycled. Some interval passed that felt like a full rotation, sleep and wake, or something approximate. Food arrived through a different seam in the wall, a tray of something gelatinous that had no smell but sustained her. She ate it without enthusiasm and without hesitation, because hesitating would have been a waste of time she didn't have to waste. On what she estimated was the 3rd cycle, they came back. There were 4 of them this time. The original 3 and a 4th who moved differently, higher status, or different function, or both. This one's layered material was a different configuration. It entered first and stood in the center of the cell and looked at her with its sensory cluster in a way that felt less like assessment and more like communication, like it was trying to hand her something and waiting to see if she could receive it. It touched its head. It pointed at her. It opened its appendage again in that blooming gesture. Then it did something new. It produced a small flat object and held it up. The object projected an image, and the image was her. Not her as she was now, in a cell with damaged memory and no name she could access. Her as she had apparently been, in a uniform she didn't recognize but whose design felt right. With people around her, she couldn't quite resolve into faces, but whose body language said something she could read. The image was a still, taken from some distance, and it showed her mid-gesture, talking, and the people around her were listening, all of them, fully turned toward her, the kind of listening that meant something. She looked at the image for a long moment. She felt the 7 names sitting in the intact nodes of her implant like stones in a pocket, heavy, real, present. She looked up at the 4th one. "You want me to think that's gone," she said. Her voice was rough from disuse but steady. "You want me to think I'm whoever you're going to tell me I am. Someone without context. Someone you can fill in." The 4th one tilted its wide, flat head. It didn't understand her words. But it understood her tone, she thought. It understood that she was speaking rather than complying, responding rather than breaking. And something in its sensory cluster shifted in a way she couldn't fully read, but which felt like recalibration. She said the 7 names. Quietly, one at a time, looking directly at the 4th one while she said them. She didn't know what the names looked like to someone who couldn't speak her language. She didn't know if they registered as threat or prayer or nonsense. She only knew that saying them out loud moved them from the implant into the room, made them real in a way that existed outside any technology they could sweep or delete, inscribed them in air, in her voice, in the irreducible fact of her having said them. The 4th one made a sound. A single low tone. It was the first time she'd heard them make a sound that didn't seem addressed to each other, and she didn't know what it meant. It left. They all left. In the silence, after the door sealed, she felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, more like alignment, the feeling of a compass needle finding north. She knew something now that she hadn't been sure of before. The deletion sweep had not been done by the beings that held her. The deletion sweep had been done before she got here, by someone who had known she was coming here, or known she was at risk of getting here. Someone had tried to strip her down to nothing before she could be captured, to leave these people with an empty vessel. They had not succeeded. She turned her attention back to the panel beside the door. She had been studying it for 3 cycles now, and she had a theory about the 3rd marking from the left. She began to test it. The test took patience. She had a supply of patience that surprised her. It felt deep, practiced, the kind you build through repetition, through having waited out bad situations before, and learned that waiting is not the same as losing. She moved through the tests methodically. She was wrong about the third marking. She was also wrong about the fifth. But the second one, when she pressed and held it at an angle rather than straight on, produced a sound from behind the wall that was different from all the other sounds in the cell. A mechanical response, something cycling. The door seam didn't open, but a panel in the floor did. She looked down into it. It was dark. It smelled like the corridor outside her cell, that same ozone copper compound, which meant it connected to the facility rather than ventilating to open space. It was large enough for her to move through if she moved carefully. She sat with that for a moment. The gap, the option, the fact that it had been there for 3 cycles while she'd been looking at the wrong surfaces. She thought about the 7 names. She thought about the feeling of watching someone else sleep, and the grief she couldn't put a face to yet, and the meal she'd eaten while tired and cared for, and the joke she only knew by its punchline. She thought about the image the 4th one had shown her. Herself, talking, people listening. She lowered herself into the gap. The crawl space ran in 2 directions. She went left because left felt like away from center, toward the periphery of whatever structure held her, toward the conceptual location of exits. She moved on her hands and knees through the dark, using touch and the subtle changes in air pressure and temperature to orient herself, filing everything the way she'd been filing things since she woke up. The slight warmth from the left wall suggesting conduit, the change in floor texture suggesting a transition between facility zones. The distant sound of repeated tonal exchanges that she was beginning to recognize as something structured, maybe a communication pattern. She found a junction. She stopped and listened. The sound was coming from the right branch, closer now, and she could distinguish individual voices in it. The same clicking and tonal modulation she'd been hearing from the 3 who attended her, but more of them, overlapping, the acoustic texture of a room with multiple people in it. She moved left again, away from the voices, and hit a vertical shaft after another 40 meters. She went up. Going up was almost always toward less density, toward outer skin, toward whatever passed for sky. The shaft had features she could use for climbing. Not handholds exactly, but junctions, intersections with horizontal runs, lips and edges that her hands remembered how to use without needing instructions. She climbed. The ozone's copper smell thinned as she went. After a long time she felt a change in the air, a coolness with actual variability, a slight movement, not the recycled stillness of sealed interior but something from outside. She came out through a membrane she didn't understand, a material that gave under pressure and sealed behind her, biological in character, sphincter-like. And she was outside. The sky was a color she had no name for. Not quite purple, not quite the color of deep water, but something in that family. There were 2 light sources at different angles, neither of them large, and the light they threw was fractured in ways that made shadows strange and distance hard to judge. The facility she'd emerged from was large. She could see its outer wall curving away on both sides, a pale material that absorbed the light without much reflection. There was vegetation, or something that performed the function of vegetation, in clusters at distances she estimated, and beyond that, more structures, a settlement or installation of some kind. She was on an alien world. This was not a surprise. She'd been building toward that conclusion for 3 cycles, but the confirmation of it, the physical sensation of alien air in her lungs, alien light on her skin, settled something. She was as far from anything familiar as it was possible to be. She went through an inventory of what she had, her body, her implant with its surviving distributed nodes, the 7 names, the procedural knowledge in her hands and instincts, the feeling of having done hard things before, the lean of her mother's handwriting into wind. She started moving toward the far structures, staying low, using the vegetation analogs for cover, and letting her body remember how to do this, even when her mind couldn't explain the technique. She moved fast, and she moved quietly, and she watched everything, and she made herself breathe slowly because breathing was the thing she could control most reliably, and control was what she had to work with. Behind her, after a time, she heard sounds from the facility. She didn't look back. Looking back was a different kind of problem. There were 8 settlements in her line of sight, graduated by size, and she was betting on the smallest being the furthest from the administrative or military center of whatever this installation was. She was betting on the logic of infrastructure, that the smallest outlying cluster would have the highest ratio of functional systems to surveillance, the most opportunity to find something she could use. She'd been betting on that logic for a long time, she thought, in places she couldn't remember. The bet usually paid. The smallest cluster was a 15-minute movement through difficult terrain. She made it in 12. The structures up close were more varied than they'd appeared from a distance. Different sizes and apparent functions, with vehicles parked in configurations she studied briefly and then filed away. Some of the vehicles had what looked like long-range capability, a design language that implied travel beyond this installation. She needed one of those. She needed to know what she was working with first. There was a structure at the cluster's edge that had no apparent function she could identify. No vehicles, no activity, no distinguishing features except that it was not lit from within the way the others were. A dark building in a lighted compound is either unoccupied or important. She moved toward it. It was a storage facility. She knew this immediately upon entering. The organizational logic, the stacking, the systematic arrangement of objects whose specific purpose she couldn't always determine, but whose general character she could read. Supplies, equipment, the infrastructure of a sustained operation. She moved through it with her hands, reading by touch, and the sparse outer light filtering through membraned openings, and she found three things that mattered. The first was a portable power source, small enough to carry, with outputs she didn't recognize but with an energy signature she could feel as heat, which meant it was active and storing charge. The second was a communication device. She was not certain of this, but the object had the right density and the right arrangement of markings, a personal scale thing with an interface designed for use by a single operator. The third was a container of something she didn't recognize. She opened it. Inside were objects of different sizes, organized in a way she could only describe as personal, the arrangement of someone's kept things rather than stored equipment. Small objects. A folded material that might be fabric. Something that looked like it had been made by hand rather than manufactured. At the bottom of the container, wrapped in more fabric, was a flat object approximately the size and shape of her implant's external reader. She unwrapped it. It was a recording device of some kind. She couldn't be certain, but the form factor and the presence of an output face suggested stored content, something archived and carried. The kind of object someone kept because it held something they couldn't lose. She thought about her mother's handwriting, the lean of it, the wind that wasn't there. She thought about the fourth one showing her the image, herself talking, others listening. That hadn't been a threat or an inducement. She understood this now, in retrospect, with the additional data point of this container. That had been an attempt at communication. We know who you were. We know you had context. Work with us. She hadn't understood it that way in the moment, because she'd been defending herself. She'd been reading every gesture as threat, every object as weapon or trap, because that was the only grammar she'd had for the situation. She set the recording device back in the container. This was not a military installation. She ran it again, slower. The three who had attended her, their demeanor, the absence of visible weapons, the procedural character of their visits, the fact that they'd brought food, the fourth one with the image, the posture of it, the single low tone before it left, the storage facility with its organized personal effects, its absence of armaments, the settlement clusters with their graduated sizes and functional variety and general absence of the specific density and movement patterns that she associated with military operations, even though she couldn't remember what military operations she'd seen. This was not a military installation. This was something else. She thought about the deletion sweep. Someone had swept her implant before she got here. Someone who knew she was coming here had decided she should arrive empty, should arrive as no one, should be found by these beings without her history intact. She had been trying to figure out if the deletion was an act of protection, remove the sensitive data before capture, or an act of something worse, something that had to do with making her cooperative, making her blank, making her into something that could be handed over and shaped. She sat in the dark storage facility and let herself have the feeling of not knowing. It was a specific discomfort, not unbearable but persistent, a stone in the shoe of her thinking. She didn't know who had swept her. She didn't know if they were people or not. She had 7 names. She had the procedural knowledge in her hands. She had the sense that she had done hard things before, and that the doing of them had shaped her into someone she mostly recognized, even through the gaps. She took the portable power source and the communication device, and she left the personal container exactly as she'd found it. Outside, the 2 light sources had moved significantly. Time had passed, planetary rotation continuing its indifferent work. The facility sounds behind her had changed in character, less alarm, more systematic. A search pattern rather than a response. They were good at this, whoever they were. She respected that without finding it reassuring. She moved toward the vehicles. The one she wanted was a mid-range type, not the largest and not the smallest, with an enclosed operator space and what looked like sealed cargo capacity. She studied its interface for 4 minutes, the longest 4 minutes she'd spent so far. Kneeling in the dark beside an alien vehicle, trying to read a control system she'd never seen, using nothing but pattern recognition and the intuition of someone who had apparently learned to read systems as a professional practice. There was a sequence, she found it. She didn't understand it, but she found it the way you find the shape of a word in a language you don't speak. Through the logic of structure, the placement of importance, the way the most used paths wear themselves into visibility. The vehicle activated. She had a moment, brief, almost nothing, where she felt something she couldn't name. Not triumph, which was too loud for what this was, more like recognition. The thing that happens when a door opens that you've been working on for a long time, and you're not relieved exactly. You're just back to the work, just the next step in the work, but you're doing it, and that means something. She moved the vehicle out of the cluster slowly, without lights, reading the terrain through the vehicle's forward membranes and her own adjusted eyes. Behind her, the facility. Before her, the strange sky with its two-source fractured light. The vehicle had no obvious navigation interface. There was a panel she hadn't figured out yet. Several markings she couldn't parse. And one that pulsed faintly in a rhythm she was beginning to read as directional. A gradient she could follow, toward something or away from it. She chose toward. She chose toward on the logic that staying equidistant from all points was the same as surrendering to geography. And she'd never been good at surrender, even when she couldn't remember why. The road curved through the vegetation analogs, and she let herself observe them properly for the first time. Now that she wasn't running, they were tall, taller than trees at home, though she couldn't have said what trees at home looked like, only that she knew the scale of them as a reference, and they moved in something that wasn't quite wind, a slight rhythmic oscillation that might have been thermal or biological or both. Their surface caught the fractured light and held it for a moment before releasing it. A slow cycling of brightness that reminded her of something she couldn't name. Something calm. Something she associated with the feeling of not being alone, which was a specific feeling distinct from the feeling of safety. And she was starting to understand that the two things had been more entangled in her past life than she'd perhaps appreciated when she'd had it. The road broadened after 2 kilometers. Broadened meant use, and use meant population density, and population density meant risk and also possibility. She slowed. There were other vehicles on the road now, ahead of her, going in the same direction, low-slung things with a different profile than the ones she'd taken. Smaller. Civilian in character, she thought. In the same way, she thought things about military installations. By some deep layer recognition, she couldn't trace to a specific memory. She fell into their pace and let herself become part of the traffic, which was a small and specific thing to feel grateful for, but she felt it anyway. Somewhere out there was whatever had brought her here. Somewhere out there, or not out there, but inside the surviving nodes of her implant, were the 7 people whose names she'd said aloud into a room as an act of stubbornness and grief and refusal. She reached inward briefly as she drove. She found a fragment she hadn't cataloged yet. Small, tucked in the corner of a memory whose main content was missing, the way a forgotten note falls out of a book. It was auditory. Someone's voice, close, the tone of someone saying something that was meant only for her, the register of genuine transmission, rather than communication for a room. She couldn't make out the words, but she could hear the intention. You know how to do this. She didn't know whose voice it was. She would probably never know, with the damage to the implant, what it was. But she kept it anyway. She added it to the stones in her pocket, the weight she was carrying forward. She found something else, a layer deeper, in a node she'd missed on her first mapping pass because it was indexed under a feeling she hadn't expected to find intact. Embarrassment. Not fear, not grief, not the high-frequency emotions the deletion sweep would have been designed to prioritize. Small, low-value, human embarrassment. Indexed there, in the amber-warm corner of her intact memory. A briefing. Not the full briefing, not the operational specifics, but the shape of what they'd been told, and the emotional residue of how she'd received it. She'd been skeptical. She'd pushed back on something, and the pushback had been noted, and she'd felt the small heat of it afterward, the way you feel when you've spoken and aren't sure it was worth speaking. She rolled that feeling over carefully. Someone had given her information and she hadn't simply accepted it. She was someone who pushed back, who asked the second question, who didn't defer by default. That was character, not event. That was the shape of her, intact, because it lived in the wrong category for a deletion sweep to find. She was beginning to feel like someone again. It was not a comfortable feeling, precisely. It was more like circulation returning to a limb that had been still. The pins and needles of becoming present, of reoccupying territory that had been vacated. It hurt in specific places, the absences, the faces she couldn't reach yet, the context that was simply gone. But it was hers, the pain was hers. Even the emptiness was shaped by what it was missing, and the shape was recognizable. The vehicle followed the broader road into the settlement's outer ring. Up close, the settlement was larger than she'd estimated from the rise. Structures of varied material and form, some smooth-walled and sealed, some with more open configurations that suggested less concern about environment control, some that appeared to be active workspaces with what she read as organized industry, the equipment and arrangement of deliberate production. The beings she could see moving between structures weren't uniformed or configured for security. They were, as far as she could tell, going about the regular business of a functioning population. An outpost, she thought. Something established enough to have routine, not something temporary. She needed to find a communication uplink. She needed to reach someone who could tell her who she was, or who could be reached by the people who were looking for her, assuming anyone was. The question of whether anyone was looking, and of who would be looking if they were, sat at the center of everything she was managing not to think about directly. She parked the vehicle in a cluster of other vehicles and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap. The names. She went through them again, not because she'd forgotten. She had them engraved in the surface of herself now. She could no more lose them than she could lose the lean of her mother's handwriting. But because the act of going through them was something. It was a form of contact. It was her way of keeping them present, of refusing to let them become abstract, of maintaining the specific reality of each person against the erosion of not knowing. She said the first name and felt the weight of it. The quality of presence she associated with this person, the particular flavor of reliability, the sense of someone who would be where they said they'd be. She said the second name and felt a different weight, something with more humor in it, more friction. Someone who made things harder in exactly the right ways. The third name came with a kinesthetic memory, the feeling of moving alongside this person in a tight space, the coordination of it, the unspoken negotiation of two people who'd learned each other's rhythms. The fourth, the feeling of being corrected and being grateful for it. The fifth, something warm and protective that she associated with mornings, with before the work, with the specific grace period of preparation before the day got hard. The sixth, a voice, this one more present than the others, closer to the surface. And she spent a moment on it. There was something about this voice that suggested history, not the functional history of working together, but the longer, prior kind. The kind that meant there were references between them that no one else would understand. That meant there were versions of her this person had known that she herself couldn't currently access. The seventh, grief. Not the surrounding medium of grief she swam in generally, the background radiation of everything she'd lost. This name landed with specific grief, targeted grief. The grief of someone who was gone, not the deletion kind of gone, the other kind. She held this one the longest. She didn't push toward the full memory. She wasn't sure she'd survive it at full resolution. Not tonight, not in an alien vehicle on an alien road, trying to build herself out of survivors' scraps. She let herself have the grief at its edge, the shape of it without the center, and she let it mean what it meant. That she had loved someone and lost them, and the loving and the losing were both still here, intact, unsweepable. She breathed. She got out of the vehicle. The air hit her again. The alien quality of it. Slightly wrong in the mouth, slightly wrong in the lungs, the kind of wrong you could live with for a long time before it became a problem. She cataloged that as something to address, filed it under non-immediate, kept moving. There was a structure near the center of the settlement cluster that had what she read as communication infrastructure, an array on its roof that the others didn't have, a particular configuration of emission-capable surfaces. She moved toward it with the purposeful but not urgent pace of someone who knew where they were going and had ordinary reasons for being there. No one stopped her. No one seemed to notice her specifically, though she drew some sensory cluster orientation from the beings she passed, the equivalent of a second glance. She was different from them in obvious ways. But she was also upright and moving with direction and not bleeding or making distress signals, which apparently translated well enough to leave her alone. The structure was not locked. She went in. Inside. Warm, darker than outside, a smell of something electrical and something organic in equal proportion. Rows of equipment arranged around the walls, and in the center a single operator station, clearly designed for the beings who built this place, sized for their proportions, their limb configuration. She studied it for a long moment, and then she sat down in it anyway, folded into it, and she started to read the interface. It was not the same system as the door panel. It was not the same system as the vehicle. But it was organized. Everything here was organized. She was beginning to appreciate this about whoever had built these places. They were systematic in their thinking. They filed things in logical relationships. They believed in the coherence of systems. And organization was a language she apparently spoke. She found the transmission interface. She found the frequency controls. She found what appeared to be a long-range communication function, distinct from the local operational channels. She sat with the frequency controls for a long time. She didn't know what channel to use. She didn't know what communication protocols her people operated on, whether there were search and rescue frequencies broadcasting into this region, whether anyone was scanning for a signal from her implant's emergency beacon. And she didn't know if her implant's emergency beacon was still functional after the deletion sweep. She touched the back of her skull. She found the implant's manual emergency output, a hardware-level function below the software layer, below anything a deletion sweep could touch. She felt for the activation point. It was there, intact, unchanged, the kind of redundancy that got built into critical systems by engineers who'd thought about failure modes. She pressed it. The implant sent a pulse. She felt it go, a specific sensation, a door opening outward into space, a signal traveling on a frequency that was about as subtle as a shout in an empty building. If anyone was listening on the right frequency and range of this system, they'd hear it. If anyone she belonged to was within range, or had vessels within range, or had any kind of intelligence presence in this sector of space, they would hear it, and they would know what it meant. She sat back and looked at the ceiling. She didn't know how long she waited. The two light sources outside moved in their different arcs. The facility behind her presumably continued its search. She sat in the alien communication station, and she let herself be still, which was different from waiting, because waiting implied helplessness, and she was not helpless. She was resting between actions. She was the person who had gotten out of the cell and through the crawl space and across the compound and into this chair. And she would still be that person whatever happened next. There was a sound from the equipment, a response on the frequency she'd opened. Not words she understood, a tone pattern. But the tone pattern had a specific structure. A carrier, a repeat, the universal grammar of, "I heard you, I am here." And she felt something happened in her chest that she didn't have a word for yet, something that would probably become tears later when she had the space for it, but right now was just a fierce and specific warmth. She keyed the response sequence. 3 pulses. Confirmed. Come for me. The communication station hummed around her. Somewhere in the alien dark, something was moving toward her. She didn't know how long it would take. She didn't know what shape the people who were coming would have, or what she would remember when she saw their faces, or how much of herself she'd get back when the gaps started filling in. She knew it wouldn't be clean. She knew the 7th name would still carry its weight, the specific grief of the person who was gone, and wasn't coming back regardless of how the rest of this resolved. She knew there would be an accounting, eventually, for whoever had run the deletion sweep, and she held no particular certainty about what she'd learn when she got to it. Maybe a decision she'd have made herself, maybe not. She was prepared to find out. The vehicle was still where she'd parked it. The settlement moved around her in its routines. She went back to it and she sat, and she let herself exist, which was its own form of action, its own refusal, its own specific variety of human stubbornness. The kind that doesn't look like stubbornness from the outside because it's just a woman sitting in a vehicle on an alien world at the end of a very long day, carrying the names of people she loved, waiting for a sound from the dark. The sound came before the first light source had finished setting. A change in the quality of the sky. A vibration at a frequency she recognized below the level of explanation. Her body knowing it before her mind did. The felt sense of something familiar approaching through a ceiling of unfamiliar atmosphere. She got out of the vehicle and she stood and she looked up. The shape that came through the sky was not beautiful. It was functional and worn, and the size of it The specific silhouette triggered something in her implant at a depth the deletion sweep had not reached, and what surfaced was not information but feeling. The feeling of home, which was not a place, she understood now, but a particular density of relationship. The weight of the people who knew you inside it. She stood on alien ground, with alien light coming from two directions at once, and she said all 7 names, quietly, one more time. Then she walked toward the landing zone. She was still no one on paper. She was still a gap in a record somewhere, a flagged anomaly, a file with most of its contents corrupted. She didn't have her history back. She didn't have her rank, or her mission, or the full weight of everything she'd been before whatever sequence of events had brought her here. But she had her hands. She had the things the deletion hadn't reached because they'd been filed under love and grief and the stubborn human habit of attaching ourselves to each other in ways that outlast everything that tries to erase us. She had a communications officer who'd heard a pulse from across the dark and turned a ship around. She had the lean of handwriting into wind. She had 7 names, and she was going to walk them back. The ship's ramp came down. Light spilled out of it, warm and interior, and known in the way of things that have been present for a long time. Figures at the top of it, silhouettes she couldn't resolve yet into faces. And she was walking now without having decided to walk. Her body covering the distance, while her mind was still somewhere behind her, still back in the cell, still pressing the back of her skull and finding the implant, and making the choice to go inward instead of give up. The first figure came down the ramp to meet her. She didn't know the face. Or she did. She did. Somewhere in the intact nodes, in the warmth index distributed storage of everything she still was. But she couldn't yet bring it forward into clear resolution. She stood and she looked and she let herself try, and the trying was something. The trying was her, the tireless human insistence on reconstruction, on finding the pattern, on refusing to accept that what had been taken stayed taken. The figure was close now, close enough that she could hear breathing, close enough for the light from the ship to catch a face. The 6th name, she knew it. Not from the implant's retrieved fragments, but from something prior to the implant, prior to any technology, prior to the whole apparatus of keeping and storing and accessing. She knew it from the structure of the face itself, from the way a face that has been looked at many thousands of times becomes a kind of home you carry inside your own eyes. She did not say the name out loud this time. She had said it enough times. She held it instead quietly and let the distance between them close. "Hey," the figure said, the voice. The 6th name's voice, and it matched exactly. And something in her implant responded to it the way a compass responds to north. Not by thinking, just by aligning. "Hey," she said back. The alien sky turned above them. The 2 light sources moved in their different arcs. Behind her, somewhere in the settlement, there would be 3 beings reconsidering what they'd thought they understood about humans, and what had happened to the empty vessel they'd expected to find. She'd think about that later. She'd think about a great many things later. The deletion, the accident, the long road back to everything she'd been. It would take time. It would not be clean or simple or complete, but she was upright. She was at the bottom of a ramp that led somewhere known. She had the 6th name in front of her and the other 6 in her pocket, and the 7th's grief folded carefully, somewhere it could be carried, without being the only thing she was. She walked up the ramp. The light was warm. The ramp rose behind her. Above her the ship sealed itself, familiar and worn and functional, and began to lift. She was still no one, technically. She was working on it. She didn't have a plan past the next 3 kilometers. She didn't have a name she could remember. She didn't know which side of the conflict she'd been on, or whether the side she'd been on had deserved her. She didn't know if anyone was coming for her, or if the deletion sweep was something her own people had done to her, or if the 7 names she carried were people who were still alive somewhere. What she had was this: she was upright. She was moving. She had her hands and her instincts and the distributed nodes of her memory that they hadn't been able to reach because they'd looked in the wrong places. Because they'd looked for data when the important things were stored under love and grief, and the specific weight of people she'd trusted with her life. She had the lean of her mother's handwriting. She had the punchline of a joke. She had a meal eaten while very tired, and the feeling that the world was, despite evidence, fundamentally survivable. She was no one technically, a woman without a name, without verified history, without documentation or rank or affiliation she could prove. She drove. The first light source was beginning to set. The second, smaller one was rising to replace it. The vegetation anise logs threw double shadows in 2 different colors, and the road beneath her, She had found a road, a surface that had been deliberately flattened and maintained, curved ahead into darkness she couldn't see through yet. She said the 7 names again, quietly to herself, the way you say a thing, not because anyone is listening, but because saying it makes it real in a way that silence doesn't. 7 names. 7 weights in the pocket. 7 reasons the deletion hadn't worked. She thought about what the 4th one had done. The single low tone. She had been thinking about that tone for a long time. The way it had come after she'd said the names, after she'd looked directly at it and spoken instead of broken. She'd been trying to read it as threat assessment, as strategic recalibration, as any number of adversarial frames. But a single low tone, addressed to her, after she'd said names which it couldn't understand, after she'd done the most specifically human thing she'd had available to do, which was to say the names of people she'd loved into the face of something that had wanted to empty her. She thought it might have been acknowledgement. She thought it might have meant, I see what you are, not a threat, not a surrender. Just, I see what you are and it is not what we expected. And we are reconsidering. She didn't know what they'd reconsidering toward. She didn't know if any version of this ended in anything other than hard options and harder costs. She'd been rebuilt from fragments, from the sweep hiss hadn't found, because it hadn't known to look under love. She was made of echoes, and she was driving an alien vehicle through alien dark with a dead crew in her pocket. And she was the least blank that anyone had ever been after a deletion, she thought. Come find me then, she thought. I'm not empty and I'm not done, and wherever you send next, they're going to meet what I've still got. She crested a rise in the road, and the settlement spread below her, lit and living, functional and foreign, and she stopped the vehicle there for a moment and looked at it and let herself want. Not to go home, because she didn't know where home was, but to find the next thing, and the thing after that, and to carry the 7's names through all of them, until she could give each one back to the person it belonged to. She breathed. She drove down into the lights.